Hi everybody. I hope this video finds everyone healthy and free of any illnesses. If anyone in your family or yourself is ill, I genuinely wish you a very, very rapid recovery. As you can see, I am fine. And thank you, by the way, for some of the well wishes that I have received. Anyway, this video presentation is about Chapter 3, which is in the area of biopsychology, sometimes called physiological psychology. You've heard me mention this numerous times during our previous lectures. So let's cut to the chase here. Biopsychology explores the biological mechanisms that underlie behavior. And among the many things that it does study, one is the area of genetics, or rather the application of genetics to biopsychology. In genetics, we're talking about focusing on how inherited genes can affect not just the physiological, but psychological traits of a person. Another biopsychological exploration involves the structure and the function of the nervous system, something that we will see in a few moments. And another important exploration area is how the nervous system interacts with the endocrine system. With regard to human genetics, studying human genetics can help researchers understand the biological basis underlying the different behaviors, thoughts, and reactions of humans. And some of the questions that are asked and answered within this domain are: why do two people infected by the same disease have different outcomes? Are there genetic components to psychological disorders such as depression? And how are genetic diseases passed through family lines? But before we even get to ask and answer those particular questions, we have to step back a little bit. And I know you recall me mentioning this numerous times within the context of the history of psychology. And that is the theory of evolution, which was promulgated by Charles Darwin. He explored the concept of inheritance of traits through the generations in his theory of evolution through natural selection. And essentially what we mean there is the organisms that are better suited for their environment will survive and reproduce, while those that are poorly suited for their environment will die off. But here is an important thing that we have to keep in mind. When we speak of survival of the fittest and natural selection, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. A point you recall that I have made, and actually I just quoted Charles Darwin. Some of the things that we're interested in here are the characteristics and behaviors that impact survival and reproduction. Those that help protect against predators, those that increase access to food, those that help offspring to survive. Here are some things that we are interested in. The genetic difference between individuals, its contribution to a species' adaptation to its environment. What we do know is that it begins when an egg containing 23 chromosomes is fertilized by a sperm containing 23 chromosomes. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here. You learned this in basic biology. I'm going to go over some essential terms because I want you to know them for our exam. And one concept, or term rather, that I think you're familiar with is the chromosome. The chromosome is a long strand of genetic information known as DNA. Also, for some of us who love to spew out those big terms, deoxyribose nucleic acid. That's what DNA means. It's a helix shaped, which means it's sort of like spirals, like that, helix-shaped molecule made of nucleotide base pairs. In each chromosome, sequences of DNA make up the genes. What is a gene? A gene is a sequence of DNA that controls or partially controls physical characteristics known as traits, eye color, hair color, etc. A gene may have multiple possible variations or alleles, which is a specific version of a gene. A specific gene may code for hair color, and the different alleles of that gene affect what the hair color will be. Two other concepts, terms that I want to mention, hint, hint, because I'm probably going to ask you a question or two about this, is the concept of genotypes and phenotypes. A genotype refers to the genetic makeup of an individual based on the genetic material, the DNA, that is inherited from one's parents. The phenotype describes an individual's observable characteristics such as hair color, skin color, height, and build. One simple example is you may be phenotypically brown hair, but you may be genotypically a carrier for blonde hair, which means if you are phenotypically brown and you're carrying a gene for blonde hair, it is possible for you to produce children who will have blonde hair if your partner or whoever is providing the other 23 chromosomes also has that genotype for a blonde hair gene, which also raises the issue of dominance and recessiveness. And what we mean by dominance is that the gene will be expressed phenotypically, and while recessiveness, that gene will not be expressed. Only in the case of two recessive genes being in a given individual will that recessive gene be expressed phenotypically. There is a lot more regarding that in your textbook. So now let's get into the cells of the nervous system. Principally, the nervous system is made up of two types of cells, neurons and glial cells. Neurons are the basic units of the nervous system, and they are responsible for conducting nerve impulses needed for tasks associated with the nervous system. They are responsible for the reception, the conduction, and the transmission of electrochemical signals. Glial cells provide physical and metabolic support to neurons, and they include neuronal insulation and communication and nutrients and waste transportation. Some call it the glue. As a matter of fact, glial actually means glue. And interestingly, they outnumber neurons on the order of 10 to 1. Some of these cells in the nervous system are which we would classify as glial cells, would be oligodendrocytes, which are principally inside the brain and the spinal cord, Schwann cells, which we principally find in the peripheral nervous system, and astrocytes and microglia, where we find heavily concentrated in the brain. Let's now talk about neuronal structure. The function of a neuron is aided by specific aspects of its structure. It contains a semi-permeable membrane that allows smaller molecules or molecules without an electrical charge to pass through it, while also stopping larger or highly charged molecules. The incoming electrical signals from other neurons are received by the dendrites, which then send the signal down the axon. I refer you to figure 3.8 of the OpenStax textbook in chapter 3, where it shows an illustration of a prototypical neuron and contains all the essential parts that I expect you to know for the second exam. Well, for one thing, axons are covered in a myelin fatty sheath made of a substance that insulates axons and allows the signal to travel down the axon quicker. At the end of the axons are terminal buttons, which contain synaptic vessels, storage sites for chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The space between two neurons, and incidentally, neurons really never touch each other. They're always separated by a minuscule space called a synapse. More formally defined, the synapse is a space between the terminal button of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. Neural communication is an electrochemical event. And that is that neurons are surrounded by extracellular fluid and contain intracellular fluid. The communication of an electrical signal depends on these fluids being electrically different. Some concepts that you need to fundamentally understand. One is called the membrane potential. This refers to differences in charge across the neuronal membrane. The fluids, both intracellular and extracellular, contain ions which cause the electrical charge. And some of these ions are sodium, chloride, potassium, and negatively charged proteins. Well, if you remember your chemistry, or even some of your biology, guess what sodium chloride makes? Yeah, you guessed it, salt. Okay. Before a neuron fires, it has a resting potential, which is always constant, minus 70 millivolts. In such a state, the membrane is polarized, and the charge inside the neuron is more negative than the outside, hence the minus 70 millivolt. I always found that number to be one of the fascinating biological constants. Because when you examine any organism that has a nervous system, whether you're talking about horseshoe crabs or you're talking about squid, when we measure the resting potential of their neuronal system, it is always minus 70 millivolts. Now, what I'm going to describe here probably can be adequately handled by viewing some of the video that I've included in the biopsychology folder. So please look at that. But also look at figure 3.10 in the OpenStax textbook that shows both the extracellular and intracellular membrane environment, and also pictorially shows you the concept of receptor openings. At resting potential, now remember, this is minus 70 millivolts. Sodium ions are more highly concentrated outside the cell in the extracellular fluid. The illustration in your textbook shows these as blue pentagons. So when you get a chance, take a look at that. Or maybe if you want to pause this and then go to the chapter and look at that particular illustration, it would be more helpful. Okay. Potassium, which in that illustration are purple squares, are more highly concentrated near the membrane in the cytoplasm or the intracellular fluid. Other molecules, such as chloride ions, and in the illustration these are yellow circles, and negatively charged proteins, help contribute to a positive net charge in the extracellular fluid and a negative net charge in the intracellular fluid, and as you've heard me mention, minus 70 millivolts. Now, what happens here is of importance. Neurotransmitters, more on that a little bit later, and it's well covered inside your text. Neurotransmitters from nearby neurons attach to receptors on the dendrites, causing the membrane potential to change. Now here we have the concept of depolarization. This minus 70 millivolt resting membrane potential becomes less negative, making the neuron more likely to fire. This is called excitation. Another concept is called hyperpolarization, which describes a situation when a membrane potential becomes more negative, making the neuron less likely to fire. If the level of charge reaches the threshold of excitation, and we have discovered that to be somewhere between plus 25 and 40 volts, an action potential will occur. The ion channels open, causing sodium to rush into the cell and the inside to momentarily become more positive. We call that level of change in the membrane that causes a neuron to become active the threshold of excitation. Another important concept is action potentials. This is the actual electrical signal that occurs and that's propagated down the axon of the neuron. Action potentials act on an all or none principle. The incoming signal is either sufficient to reach the threshold or it is not. Now, once action potentials have occurred, excess neurotransmitters in the synapse either drift away or are broken down and reabsorbed. But there's another interesting mechanism that takes place that neurons, and not all neuronal systems, it's useful to think of neuronal systems as those being governed by a particular neurotransmitter. What I'm alluding to is something called reuptake, and this involves moving a neurotransmitter from the synapse back into the axon terminal from which it is released. Still with me so far? Okay, let's go over some concepts that I think are very important. Neurotransmitters. These are chemical messengers of the nervous system. Different neurons release different types of neurotransmitters that have many different functions. From a biological perspective, there's the view that psychological disorders like depression and schizophrenia are associated with imbalances in one or more neurotransmitter systems. I'm going to now enumerate some neurotransmitters that are discovered very, very early, and I should point out that new neurotransmitters are discovered about every year or 2 years or so. So what I am enumerating here is not exhaustive and just barely scratches the tip of the iceberg. But I mention these in particular because it has been well known in how they relate to a variety of psychological disorders, which we're going to get back to near the end of our special semester. Okay, one neurotransmitter that's fairly ubiquitous in the system is called acetylcholine. And that neurotransmitter has been found principally to be responsible for muscle action and memory. No, don't try to increase choline in your diets with the expectation you can increase brain acetylcholine levels. That simply won't work. However, if you do want to increase brain acetylcholine levels with an eye on improving memory, guess what you can do? Get a good night's sleep. It has been well documented that getting sufficient sleep every night actually increases brain levels of acetylcholine, particularly those that are involved in the memory system. And as I mentioned, they're also involved in muscle action. Now, what about the psychological state of pain and pleasure? Well, we've discovered a number of years ago that your brain has neurotransmitters called beta endorphins, and there are many, many different types. Beta endorphins are sort of like naturally produced brain opioids. No, your brain didn't evolve to get you high, but your brain did evolve to regulate pain. When you are injured, your brain pours out large amounts of beta endorphin. But we have time to explore that later on. Another important neurotransmitter is dopamine. Dopamine has been implicated in mood alterations, sleep, and also in learning. Another neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, and we found that neurotransmitter to regulate the heart, the intestines, and mental alertness. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that has been found to be very, very important in the regulation of mood and in sleep. In fact, many antidepressant drugs are act principally on the serotonin system, because research has shown that when a person becomes clinically depressed, their brain levels of serotonin is significantly reduced. So increasing brain serotonin levels can help to alleviate depression. That has been clearly found to be the case. Now let's talk about parts of the nervous system. We can say the nervous system is principally divided into two major parts. The central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. You will find this illustrated in your OpenStax textbook. So let's talk about these parts. Let's look at the peripheral nervous system first. It is made up of two different parts. And again, at any point here, feel free to pause and look at the illustration in the OpenStax textbook, and then come back here and continue that and go back and forth. One of the nice things about doing videos is that you can always stop, pause, get back to it a little bit later, process some of the material elsewhere, get back and allow my lecture to reinforce what it is that you're acquiring. So, but anyway, as I was just saying, the peripheral nervous system is made up of two different parts. The somatic nervous system, which is principally responsible for relaying sensory and motor information to and from the central nervous system. There's also a subdivision called the autonomic nervous system. Now I say autonomic, not automatic, although it principally seems to work in an automated way because you really don't exert any conscious control over it. Well, that is not completely true, honestly. You can control some aspects of the autonomic nervous system, but it requires a considerable amount of training. An sub-area of psychology is called biofeedback, where we take some of these autonomic nervous system variables and we bring them under more conscious control with the intent of altering autonomic nervous system. I think maybe as I explain the other parts of the autonomic nervous system, what I just said will be just a little bit clearer to you. The autonomic nervous system controls internal organs and glands and can be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system involved in stress-related activities and functions. It prepares us for fight or flight. The fight or flight response is the activation of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and it allows access to energy reserves and heightened sensory capacity so that we might fight off a given threat or run away to safety. The parasympathetic nervous system acts in an opposite fashion. It is associated with routine day-to-day operations of the body under relaxed conditions. So, sympathetic nervous system activation, everything becomes elevated. Parasympathetic nervous system activation, its opposite occurs. There is a relaxation. Rest and restoration is the principal part of it. We also know it as rest and digest. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system complement each other to maintain homeostasis, a fancy word for a state of equilibrium in the body. All right, let's talk a little bit about the central nervous system, which is essentially the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is comprised of billions of interconnected neurons and glia. And when I say billions, I mean not just 1 billion or 2 billions. I am talking about 100 billion interconnected neurons. And as you heard me mention earlier, the number of glial cells that are in the brain are much, much more numerous, on the order of anywhere between 8 to 10 times more glia than there is build the 100 billion neurons and so. So that is just a staggering number of cells in a system that is just so obviously compacted between what's up inside here and then what also goes up and down the inside of your spinal cord. And keep in mind, once neuromaterial exits the spinal cord, it becomes part of the peripheral nervous system. Anyway, the brain is also bilateral. It has two sides, a left side and a right side. And they are separated into distinct lobes, but all the areas interact with each other. What I strongly recommend that you do, either wanting to pause it now and taking a break from my lecture, or maybe you want to wait until afterwards and then look at it on your own. I put an interesting video. It's a little over an hour, maybe almost an hour and a half long, and I believe it's called the Mysteries of the Mysteries of the Brain. It's a really interesting movie. I think you'll find it very, very instructive, informative, as well as entertaining, because much of what's contained in this chapter is sort of like illustrated inside this movie. And you get some really nice three-dimensional rotational figures, as well as interesting anecdotes, stories, and narratives being told by some of the people in this video. So do take a look at that. It's really, really good. It's one of my favorite. Anyway, so much for the brain. Now we have the spinal cord. The spinal cord delivers messages to and from the brain. And it has its own systems of reflexes. And you remember, I tested one of them. I sat on top of the table and I initiated a patella reflex. It has its own system of reflexes, as I mentioned, and some of which are tested in newborn infants. More on that a little bit later. The top of the merges with the brainstem. That's the top of the spinal cord merges with the brainstem, and the bottom ends just below the ribs. Functionally, it's organized into 30 segments, each connected to a specific part of the body through the peripheral nervous system. Generally, sensory nerves bring messages in and up to the brain. Motor nerves send messages out to the muscles and the organs. In moments of survival, automatic reflexes allow motor commands to be initiated without sending signals from sensory nerves to the brain first, allowing for very, very quick reactions. Think the next time you go walking, kind of like just focus a little bit about what your legs are doing. I bet you didn't know that activity of you moving one leg in front of another is completely automated by the spinal cord, part of a reflex arc system in there. Well, and that makes a lot of sense, because when you think about walking down the street and you're chatting with a friend, and of course now today, if you are doing that outside, you got to maintain a 6-foot difference, okay? And that is, of course, that's important. There's no overemphasizing that. I hope everyone is following that. But you'll notice that you can talk, converse, think about something else while you continue to walk. Well, that's occurring because you don't have to think about walking. Your spinal cord is already producing many of the reflexes, the reflex actions that are involved in it. Let's get back to the brain, and in particular the surface of the brain. Known as the cerebral cortex, it's covered with bumps and folds called gyri. Small grooves called sulci, and large grooves called fissures, such as the longitudinal fissure that divides the brain into left and right hemispheres. Again, I refer you to the illustrations in the OpenStax College Textbook, Chapter 3. There are just absolutely wonderful illustrations in there demonstrating both what sulci and gyri look like, and in particular the big main fissure separating the left and right hemispheres called the longitudinal fissure. Now, there's another concept that I feel I need to introduce to you, which is very important, and it's the notion of lateralization. This is a concept that each hemisphere of the brain is associated with specialized functions. What we've learned over the decades is that the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Getting back to the cerebral cortex, if you watch that Mysteries of the Brain video that's in the folder on biological psychology, and again, I strongly encourage you to view that in the video entirely. It's just well done and it's entertaining. And you'll see just wonderful illustrations of what I'm going to describe to you now. Of course, it's well illustrated in the textbook as well. I'm talking about the lobes of the brain. And we basically break up the lobes of the brain into 4 different lobes. So there's the frontal lobe, which is over here, the parietal lobe, which is over here, the occipital lobe, which you recall I've illustrated for you in the past, is in the back of the brain. You put your hand back over here, you're putting your hand over the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, which is on the side. And you have 2 frontal lobes, one on the left side, one on the right side, 2 parietal lobes, blah, 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 bringing actually the total number of lobes to 8. But we really only refer to them as 4 lobes because specific functions are related to it. The frontal lobe is the area where there's a lot of decision making and a lot of planning and organizing. The occipital lobe is principally vision. And I suppose I can get into the other lobes, but it's also well described in your textbook, so I'll leave it for that. So as I just said, the frontal lobe is involved in planning, organizing, judgment, but also attention, reasoning. But it's also responsible for motor control, emotions, and language. There's a part of the frontal lobe, it's called the motor cortex, and it's a strip of cortex involved in planning and coordinating movement. Then we have something called the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for higher level cognitive functioning. A very, very important area that seems to be uniquely human is an area called Broca's area. And it's a region in the left hemisphere, the left side, and it is essential for language production. Damage to this particular area leads to something that has come to be called Broca's aphasia. Broca's aphasia is a condition that leads to difficulties in producing language. With regards to the temporal lobe, it is associated with hearing, memory, emotion, and some aspects of language. And located on the side of the head, as I illustrated earlier, it also contains the auditory cortex, which is a strip of cortex in that lobe that is responsible for processing auditory information. Also in that area is a place called Wernicke's area, and that is important for speech comprehension. Now, recall earlier I mentioned Broca's area. That is responsible for speech production. Wernicke's area is responsible for speech comprehension. Damage to Wernicke's area results in difficulty understanding language. If you had damage to Wernicke's area, sa hamenik atisida patnikista putetista ansida avista atisida astu as venidam atista amnegubetanistan alan awan estina menekomnetanam. Well, if you had damage to Wernicke's area, the gibberish that you just heard is probably what it's like to have damage to Wernicke's area. You would not be able to understand what normally should be comprehensible speech. And I just made all of that up. And what I mean by making that up is quite simply that the speech I made was made up, not that what I just described to you was made up. I think you know what I mean. All right, so now let's talk about the occipital lobe. That's associated with visual processing, and it contains the primary visual cortex, which is responsible for interpreting incoming visual information. And that is well illustrated in both in the movie that, again, I encourage you to review, and also in the textbook. A couple of other brain structures I want to get out of the way, and because I do want you to know them. And hint, hint, it's probably on the test. Anyway, there's an area inside the brain, and it's called the thalamus. And it serves as the relay center of the brain where most senses, excluding smell, are routed before being directed to other areas of the brain for processing. This, too, is illustrated in figure 3.22 of the OpenStax textbook, but also nicely illustrated in that movie clip that I'm alluding to. We also have a subsystem in our brain, and it's called the limbic system. The limbic system is involved in mediating emotional response and memory, and it is made up of a number of different structures, some of the most important ones being the amygdala. You've heard me mention that numerous times in the past. That is involved in our experience of emotions and tying emotional meaning to our memories. And it is also involved in processing fear. In that movie that I'm strongly encouraging you to watch, in fact, I insist on it, you will see in the very beginning part of that movie, we're talking about the involvement of the amygdala in regulating fear. But there's an interesting twist in that movie with regard to managing amygdala activity. Another important part of the limbic system is the hippocampus. And that is the structure associated with learning and memory, and in particular, spatial memory. And then another very important structure called the hypothalamus regulates homeostatic processing, including body temperature, appetite, and blood pressure. So I think I'm going to stop my lecture at this particular point, and I hope I sustained your attention long enough. And again, please read this particular chapter. There's a lot in it. And do watch any video presentations that I put in the folder. What I'm also going to include in there is some really great animation showing you what actually happens in an action potential, going from the point of going from a resting potential to actually propagation of the signal. So do review those. Those won't be terribly long video clips. The movie that I've alluded to numerous times already, that's a little over an hour, but I promise you, you'll find it very, very fascinating. So please do watch that in its entirety, and do look for some of those video clips. And of course, the textbook also has a lot of good supplementary resources. There were also sample multiple choice questions at the end of the chapter. Do those. Just keep up with the work. All right, guys. Next time you're going to hear from me is on the chapter of development. Okay, so keep up the work. Keep reading. And please, again, any questions, any issues whatsoever, please reach out to me. Okay? Bye.